How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? Uh, Slight cold at the moment, so voice is a little bit strange, but it's finally come back enough, and I was just in the mood to make another video. This channel's basically just turned into like a personal annual updates at this point in time, but for anybody who's still interested, I figure why not? Plus, I like to come back and review these types of things later for my own sakes. So, sorry for the grainy little video here. Everything's pretty dark at the moment. I've got some lights on, obviously, but not like proper, you know, bloggy podcast lights to get for a great picture or anything like that. Anyways, the subject today is what it's like to live in New York City. So I've been living in New York for about a year now. Before this, I think the last video I made on here was what it was like to live in Dublin. So I moved from Dublin over to New York. Um, and I just thought I'd talk a little bit about what it's like to have a life here. So, generally speaking, New York is, I think it's a wonderful city in the sense that it's gigantic. It can definitely be overbearing sometimes, and it has everything. Like it has a top tier class of almost anything you could ever want to encounter. You want to go see a play, you're probably going to see one of the best plays on earth. You want to go watch you know, a baseball game, a hockey game. They're going to be some of the best teams. Like they're just everything's incredibly well funded. This city is loaded with money, and everything is also very expensive. So I guess let's start with financials. This is my apartment. I live here alone. It's a studio. I live in the financial district, which is just in downtown Manhattan. This apartment costs me 3,180 US dollars every month. So it's pretty expensive. It's, I think, almost three times more than I've ever paid for rent in my life. Now, this is obviously a choice. You don't need to live in downtown Manhattan. You can easily live in Brooklyn or the Bronx or one of these other boroughs that are a little bit cheaper. I know a lot of my friends pay somewhere around probably 1,200 to 1,500 in rent, so it's about half of what I pay. However, they live with like numerous roommates in like much further locations. I chose this particular area because it takes me about 10 minutes to get to work, which is something I've found to be very valuable in life as I realized how much I love to, you know, still have personal time to do things, pursue projects and things like that. Um, the other upsides, I guess, of this is that I'm right beside a station in Manhattan called Fulton Station. Fulton Station is kind of a connecting subway line, so it has trains that come from pretty much everywhere. Before I jump from the topic of finances, though, salaries obviously are very high in New York City. You'll earn significantly more here than you will in most other countries or areas, aside from obviously other major U.S. cities. But even other major cities in other countries, you may be able to even double your earnings in Manhattan in a lot of jobs. And especially if you factor in exchange rates, like from Canadian to US, for example, the earnings are significantly higher here. So that kind of helps you pay for these types of things. At the end of the day, for me, ironically, I guess just keeping up what I would consider my standard of living that I've kept in every country I've lived in so far. My standard of living is very relatively the same here. I haven't really gone up or down. My costs have obviously increased, salaries increased alongside with it. So at the end of the day, I find personally like my savings and my financial status to be pretty much the same as anywhere else that I've lived. So, you know, even if you were to, you know, add 40-50% onto your salary, you aren't likely going to see it in your savings account just because of things like rent and the increased cost of just general life here. So speaking of which, other stuff you just kind of I stopped paying attention to specifics exactly how much you spend, but I since I've got work is in a walkable distance. It takes a little longer than 10 minutes to walk there, but so that means that I do that frequently enough that it's not worth getting a monthly subway pass. But the subway passes here are pretty reasonable, and it's a North American system, so you can go anywhere that you want and you only pay once, which is nice, as a lot of other countries have zones, which is really beneficial if you're in a small zone. But I find that the minute you're in the medium to large area, it's just significantly more expensive usually. So I do like that the system here will get you basically anywhere you're going, and you know how much it's going to cost up front. So that's really nice. Um, New York has a very kind of deprecated subway system, in my opinion. They have these Metro cards here that are just flimsy paper, and so they're very easy to destroy, damage, fall apart. And I think that's just beneficial for them because at some point in time, I'm sure the Metro Transit Authority, I think, is what they're called. They would just keep all the money on your card because you can't use it anymore. There may be a way to recoup that. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, that's kind of the general established system here. So outside of that, I guess Life is really busy for most people in New York. So everybody that I know usually works until about 7, 8 o'clock at night is pretty standard. Most people pull about 12-hour days here for like a numerous amount of jobs across many industries. Personally, I've been pretty lucky in the sense that my job had me working or has me working half the day from home usually just because I'm taking calls with people in other countries. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to rush into the office for that when I have to take early calls and things right here. I do definitely put in 12 hours pretty regularly, but since we start a little earlier, we have a lot of freedom. It doesn't feel so bad, I guess, because you are still home a lot of the time. And then when, if a meeting gets canceled in your home, you can spend 10, 15 minutes doing something for you. So I think my life has been a little bit more or better balanced than most people. But most people that I know, yeah, they seem to live in a pretty stressful way, to be totally blunt or honest about it. Um, Most of my friends, obviously, like the big industries here are like the finance industry, legal industry, and then I'd say like you get a decent amount of tech work here as well, and then just like straight up like sales and things like that happen or are kind of like the big ones that I know people in at least. I've run into quite a few people that represent these industries, and yeah, it's pretty standard across the board that everybody is what I would consider overworked, especially after living in Europe and realizing like the level of vacation, the level of support, and things like that that you can get there. It's really phenomenal. America is much more what I would call kind of a like every man for himself sort of style of structuring. So in the States, there's just a lot of systems like healthcare, even at a really big, good company, nice job. I always knew American healthcare was bad, but I always kind of personally presumed that that was for the poor, whereas universal healthcare is much better for covering everybody so that everybody gets, relatively good, affordable, and or free care. The difference, though, here is actually that even on a good healthcare system, you still have these massive deductibles. So, to speak about mine, for example, I've been informed by others at least that I have a pretty good healthcare system here. And I pay the first $2,000 every year comes out of my pocket. Then I get, I think, 80% coverage after that. And that's a good system. And you have to pay for this. So you pay every single paycheck for the accessibility of having this healthcare coverage. It's mainly in the States because healthcare can get so wildly, ridiculously expensive. This kind of a system exists mostly to protect you from like the uh-ohs. Like if you really get wounded badly and are going to be in a hospital for a long time or even a short time, but for something that just manages to rack up expenses very quickly, which is extremely easy to do here. You need that coverage so that you don't end up having to declare bankruptcy and you losing all your money for like a single hospital visit, which is definitely something that happens in the States regularly. So when I first came here, I had no health coverage for a little while, and that was always a little scary because like, I'm a pretty young, healthy individual, but I do stupid things and get hurt sometimes. And not that I've spent a lot of time or had extended hospital stays, but there's just always that possibility. And so my plan has always just been like, if I really get screwed up badly, I'm just going to go back to Canada and run away from these debt collectors in America because, yeah, like realistically, if you actually got wounded badly and had enough medical debt here, it would probably just not be worth living in this country anymore. If you had the option to get out, if you're an American, you're really screwed, which I think is obviously a terrible system, but not a lot a foreigner can do to imply change on those types of things. Other fun systems I've learned about here are things like at-will employment is another really funny one. In the States, they have something called at-will employment for people from other countries that aren't America. What this means is you can actually be fired at any point in time for any reason or without even being given a reason by your employer with no compensation. Compensation stops immediately. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. A lot of people here actually argue for it as if the employee gains some sort of power because it goes both ways. You don't need to give 2 weeks notice. You can just leave whenever you want, like that day, and it sucks for the company. You're now gone. So obviously this is pretty damaging on both sides, especially for smaller companies. Smaller companies, if you lost a critical employee randomly with no notice, would be extremely damaging. So it seems like it's kind of like people argue that it's a good system for both sides because both sides get benefits. I think generally my argument would be that it's a bad system for both sides of the coin. It means that you don't have any permanence or guarantees as an employee, and as an employer, you don't have any permanence or guarantees. Now, obviously, people don't generally do this type of thing. The thing is that I think it's extra bad for the employee. And the reason behind this one is If you leave your job immediately without notice, you've burned a bridge. Now, as an employee, that's extremely dangerous to do with some companies or people because it could affect your career in the future. Now, if a company chooses to dismiss an employee, they've burned that bridge either way, whether or not they give a 2 week notice. Leaving a job voluntarily as an employee is a normal thing to do. Firing somebody from a job is not a normal thing to do. So yeah, it's pretty wild that like those types of systems exist. It's like healthcare, employment. There's just not a lot of security, I guess, for an individual in this country. And the more time I've spent here, the more I've had my eyes open to some things. And I mean, I've been a Canadian. This is not news to me. Like I've known what it's like. I've been, very close to America my whole life, and I've had lots and lots of friends in the States. But until you're like reading these documents yourself and like getting this paperwork from work, you don't really realize like, oh my God, what is this? What is this horrible, horrible system? And especially when you've lived in other countries and experienced other systems, it's just mind-boggling. Like one time I went to the doctors in Korea without having any health insurance at all. And I wasn't employed at the time, so I didn't even have work coverage. You get national health insurance automatically when you're working in Korea. But with nothing at all, I went into a hospital, or not a hospital, I went into a doctor's office. I saw a doctor who then recommended me to a specialist in another building across the street. So I went and saw the doctor. He spoke very phenomenally good English, saw me within 20 minutes or less from a walk-in, then sent me off to the specialist who also saw me immediately upon my arrival over there, also spoke phenomenally good English. Then I got the bill and was a little concerned because I didn't really know how the system worked there, and it was $65. And that's for a complete foreigner with no coverage of any kind. Yeah, it was amazing. The regular coverage for Korea, I think, was about $10 if you go to the doctor. You pay about $10. And it's at that point, I think it's mostly an incentive to get people to not go constantly because it will, obviously cost you something. I think honestly that makes a lot of sense to me. In Canada, I almost wish we had like just a small fee there's a lot of people that abuse the system of freedom in Canada where it's literally free. You go to the doctor, you pay nothing. You show your card, government covers everything. And the issue with that is that a lot of people will literally go for anything. It's like, oh, my throat's a little sore, and they'll go to the doctor, which would be fine if we had an abundance of doctors, but we don't. So what ends up happening is everybody is so bogged down and so busy that it's like a drag on the system. Here, you don't actually get the grace. I've actually only gone and done one thing, and it was just an annual physical. I figured I hadn't gone in a few years, and I should probably go and get something taken care of. And my health coverage actually was one of the few things that covers some preventative care with it that doesn't come right out of my pocket. So I didn't have to pay the deductible. I thought this would be a great, great plan. I went to the doctor here. They took some blood, which weirdly enough kind of hit me, and I felt really dizzy once they were done. I said, oh, I was like, something, I'm just like having a bad reaction to the fact that blood was taken. It's like I feel really lightheaded, just like I'm going to need a minute. And then her said, yeah, okay. And she like gave me this little, Hershey's Kiss thing, said, eat this, it'll make you feel better. And I said, great, thank you. And then she just left and never came back. So I was sitting there feeling like there's a possibility that I may pass out. And I was worried if, I leaned the wrong way. So I was trying to make sure I was like leaned in the right way. So if I did pass out, that I would fall into the bed and be safe instead of whack my head off the floor. And yeah, I was there for over 20 minutes expecting her to come back. She just never did. So I had samples and things that I needed to give to somebody, and I had to go wander the halls myself to find someone to give it to them. And then they made an error and charged me $130 for this physical, and the bill actually came up to $1,400. And they'd knocked it down to $130 because of my insurance. And they'd made an error and it should have been covered entirely. So then I had to call and battle with them and get the doctor's office specifically to go and redo the paperwork to submit to the insurance. And it was this whole ordeal. And that was my first experience ever with the American medical system. So not exactly voting for it to be amazing. I've basically things that I've heard as a foreigner are that, yeah, it's expensive, but the treatment is the best in the world. So I think there are some extremely skilled specialists here, but general treatment seemed poorer than almost any country I've ever been in, including Canada, which has a free healthcare system, but it's not always known as the best healthcare system. There's really long waits and a lot of like overcrowding issues. And a lot of the doctors in Canada are qualified to work in America where they literally double their salary. So they do leave a lot and move here because there's always a demand for trained medical professionals. So Canada's a bit of a rough country, oftentimes in terms of how we discuss our medical system, but just leagues ahead of what they have in the States, aside from salaries. So salaries seems to be one of the major benefits about living in America. I find like you're going to earn the most money. That money is going to be obviously like useful globally because the American dollar is such a strong currency. So that's just kind of yeah, a really powerful part of living here. Obviously, like a lot of costs have risen to go with that. But in general, like food and things like that, I wouldn't say they feel any more expensive than Canada. They are a little bit more expensive than like Europe and definitely way more expensive than a lot of the countries in Asia. But all in all, it's not too bad. I think if you go and shop at bodegas and little things like that a lot in Manhattan, you'll definitely find you'll be able to spend a lot. But for a rough example, I went today and bought I think like 4 pounds of chicken for like $8, and that's just you can't get that price in Canada even. So, but that's from a new grocery store that I found close by. If I go to the one that's closest to my apartment, that would have probably cost me $35. So there's this huge variance in price. You really need to start learning like which shops to go to in this city if you want to not spend a fortune on everything that you do. As I said though, cost is definitely a big factor in living in New York. So what else should we be covering in terms of like life stuff? I know one that I've always talked about that I find interesting as a man who's managed to remain single for quite a while now, dating. So I've definitely gone and done some dating in New York City. It's been very interesting because there's so many people in such a close proximity here that if you use like a dating application, for example, you will get just a swarm of people coming in like on a regular basis. I can only imagine this is even worse for girls, as every girl that has ever shown me their dating app seems to get about 10 times as many people as the guys that I know on the same applications. And good looking guys. It's not that the guys are all terrible and the women are all gorgeous. It's you know, fair level of general appearance and things like that among the two sexes for my comparison here. So I can only imagine how wild it must be for the girls. I mean, I've had a few girls explain it to me and show me their side of things, and it is pretty crazy. So there's just a ton of people, which I think gets you that like what's next syndrome kicks in really heavily here. One, as I said, people are busy, so they don't have a lot of time. They want to, you know, they can't meet up until like 9 p.m. or something because their job won't let them out until 7 or 8. And there's, you know, 50,000 people in line waiting if you're not good enough. So you get a lot of that like kind of dismissiveness I found with interacting with people for the first time. Although there's obviously still plenty of very kind people who are pretty fantastic about it. I find the level, like New York is such an aggressive place in terms of like career progression and like success and things like that. You get some just shockingly successful people that you'll meet very regularly. Like in other countries, I wasn't quite so used to going out with, you know, I think I've probably been on dates with 3 or 4 doctors and 4 lawyers since I've been here, and that's just not usually the type of job that you meet people that are in, because there's just not that many people in those professions that are, you know, still single looking around and in my age bracket and, you know, that I would link up with. But there's just so many people here that are really driven with their careers and things like that, that you really do get connected to some fairly interesting people. Again, though, that who's next syndrome kicks in, and everyone's always trying to find the best fit for them, right? So I think these applications really lead to that, and even more so in a place like Manhattan where there's just so many people. The globalization I think is really amazing too about living here. Like there's a Koreatown, there's a Chinatown, and I've lived in other countries where there's a couple shops that are Chinese oriented or something like that, or have some goods from China shipped over. Here, the whole town feels like a small version of a Chinese city or something. Like Manhattan is a very distinctive place. I think it's really, really awesome just how how wild the variance is, and how much, if you know, like for me, sometimes I'll miss Korea. I can go to K-Town and there's, you know, very authentic Korean restaurants. All the food that I was used to eating in Korea is there. You can go to these little karaoke rooms that are very similar to the ones you'll find in Korea. There's just a ton of similarities that are way beyond what you get, say, if I did the same thing in Canada. There's like a Chinatown section of Toronto. It has never had the same feeling as the Chinatown section of Manhattan. So it's a really cool place. That's kind of my quick blurb of the positives. Let me tell you about some of the things that suck about Manhattan. Like for me, like I love, you know, like skyscrapers, and I'm like pretty driven and aggressive in a lot of ways for work wise. So a lot of really good stuff for me. I've already said a few of the bads, I guess, with in terms of like personal care and that kind of stuff in terms of the country's legality. Not to mention, I won't even get into politics, but it's a very messy system here. I found that there's just a lot of corruption when it comes to making a lot of money being kind of priority number one, which I really think is a decent way to sum up America. Like all the systems are bad, but the earning potential is high. So it seems like that's the only key factor that seems to matter. And the more and more I've interacted with people here, it seems like just inadvertently, like that's culturally something that's really been driven in. the noise, if you guys can hear this car revving over and over, you get a lot of dickheads in this city. I've had people just drive down the street and like at like 2 in the morning and they just get upset that someone walked in front of their car. So they just sit there and like slam on the horn and then like yell at them. And while they're, holding the horn down. So like I've gotten out of bed and been like, what is happening? And I go and look out the window and there's just some guy like yelling at somebody and like holding his horn down at 2 a.m. in a residential area where there's people sleeping. Nobody cares at all. Like, that's not something that bothers drivers here. So there's a ton of noise. There's a lot of construction, like a lot of construction. Everything in this city is always being built. So I moved into a building, I checked for construction, everything was fine. And then they started demoing the building next to me. So there just seems to be like, there's always some form of construction. There's some rules and regulations around it, which are often broken as well. So I've had a lot of people telling me about them being woken up at 2, 3 in the morning to jackhammers because they got a night permit for that construction zone and started to do something. So that's really annoying. There's a huge problem. Like America in general, I think is the worst country I've ever seen for drug issues. Like Canada's pretty bad too, but like people here, like there's going to be crazy people in every country, and there's going to be like homeless people in every country. There's going to be people, like worse off living on this. Like there's obviously going to be hardships for people everywhere. In Korea, like the homeless people would beg for money in a very respectful way. They would bow at the subway, and they would sometimes obstruct your path a little bit, but they would never really make any comments. They just keep their head down and put a little jar out and hope they would receive some money. They found, I guess, respect was one of the easier ways to earn it. Not that there isn't others people doing other things, but I've never seen anything like that in North America. Here, it's a scripted event, I find. Usually, like people don't ask for money in the streets too much. They definitely still do. Although I think I've been stopped by people like working for nonprofit organizations or something more frequently than homeless people asking for money. Although I've gotten a decent amount of that as well, but you get a lot of it on the subways. So what people will do is they'll go car to car, and it's ironic here because it's a prepared speech and they all have the same tone of voice. So I found it very funny because you get on the subway and someone will say, "Ladies and gentlemen," and they have this weird stoppage in their pronunciation. And it's so common here that a lot of people do the same thing when it comes to begging for money or other handouts. They will deliver their speech in that kind of way. So, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am a homeless individual. Please, if you could spare $1 or a piece of food, that would greatly help me." And then they'll often, make some comments about their religion or their beliefs or some other claim that's somehow related to what they're asking for. Often, the other thing that I've enjoyed seeing is that a lot of people who are clearly trying to earn money will get on and give their speech, but then instead of just asking for something, they actually will buy these large bulk boxes of like candy and snacks from stores, and they'll sell those at a slightly marked up price. So they kind of run their own business. Obviously, this is all super illegal, and you shouldn't be doing this on the subways, but yeah, that's kind of how that stuff works. And it does suck. To have to encounter that regularly, have to be exposed to that regularly, have to say no to so many people on the regular. You obviously, if you gave money to every person who stopped you, you would not be able to afford your own life here. That's how common it is. So there's a huge issue with that. The other side of things that I think is really bad is the I guess like the damage that happens to a lot of these people in these lower situations or bad situations, like where I've had numerous people screaming at me, yelling at me. I've had people threatening my life. That all happened very quickly upon moving here. I think within the first 2 months, I was harassed violently twice. Luckily, nothing ever came to any sort of violence. I was always like safe enough to get out of there. I do think my general demeanor towards them helped get out of those situations safely. But I did have one lady threatening to skin me alive, for example, and like leaning over me, fist cocked, like ready to hit me, threatening. A lot of threats, a lot of very, very horrible things said about me. I believe she thought that I was an American because there was a lot of comments around slavery and things like that. I was the only white person on the train at the time, so I got a lot of attention from her. So a lot of like situations like that where people have, are not just having it down on their luck, but they are clearly on some kind of drug that is, or they have some sort of mental instability that has them reacting in an extremely like outbursty, violent way. And those things I have not found that uncommon. I had another man screaming at everybody on the train about how we, again, using a ton of inappropriate language, and about how we were terrible people. And There was, like men weren't giving up their seats and things like that. And ironically, right before he got on, I'd seen this pregnant lady on the subway, and I'd tried to offer her my seat, and she was just like, no, no, no. And I was like, no, please, please, please. And she was just like, sit down. I don't want it. I've been sitting all day. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. So to me, it was kind of an ironic moment as he screamed at everyone for not giving up their seats. And I was like, man, I just tried like 5 minutes ago. Anyways, that stuff sucks. Another thing that's really bad about Manhattan is it's this dirty city. If you look at it from far away, it's so beautiful. If you go over to New Jersey and look at Manhattan, it's this gorgeous view, and the buildings look just absolutely astonishing. If you can get up high in one of the buildings downtown or in Midtown, and you can just like see unobstructed across the city, it's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. One of the views that I really enjoyed was I met a friend at the Google who works at Google, and they have this patio where you can just look over the city, and it's gorgeous. And then the building that I work at was similar. They had these two 180-degree unobstructed views that were just amazing to see. So there's so much beauty to be had in Manhattan. And then simultaneously, you go away from that far view and you get close, and it's just full of trash, like trash mountains litter the sidewalks. They don't have a standard like garbage receptacle area system here. It's literally just throw bags of trash into the street. So anything you don't want, you just throw in the street. So this is how people will like get rid of things. People will take things like, if you throw a couch in the street, someone's going to take your couch. So like people will recycle a lot of this stuff, but there's just mountains of trash, which obviously like they literally will roll into the sidewalk. You like can't go around it. Like it'll block 80% of your path to walk down the street. So yeah, it's a very trash heap of a city in a lot of ways. There's obviously just like streets are gross, like the things people have been pouring and spilling and peeing and puking all over them. Like they're disgusting in so many ways. As you can tell from my cold as well, there's a lot of like just disease that floats around. Found it's very hard to avoid if you work here. Before I started working, I was relatively healthy. Now I go into the office and everybody that I work with is sick constantly, and I just seem to be catching whatever they've got one after the other. So when you have to spend a lot of time close proximity to people, it's pretty rare you'll avoid their germs. And even just, it might not even be from them. It might just be from grabbing things on the subway, which are just, I don't know, gives you the heebie-jeebies touching all this stuff. You can see even like when you walk through a turnstile, the middle of the bar is clear and like it looks cleanish because all the hands have been like oiling it up, I guess. And then right on the edge where people won't touch this frequently, it'll be like black and grimy. Like you can tell these things have literally never been cleaned. The subways especially are very dirty. There's the New York rats are very famous, and you see them every day, if not more frequently. They'll run across the sidewalk out of the trash heaps as well. There's a lot of rats in this city, but also just like even the subways, there will be a few stations that are near the richer areas, and they'll be up like maintained and kept up. And then you'll go like you can go through a train, you look at the window, and every station you stop at, you'll know the relative level of poverty in the neighborhood based on how clean or disgusting the subway station is. So you'll go one station will be gross and like torn apart and the ceiling's falling apart, and that's just how it is, and the floor hasn't been cleaned in 15 years. And the next station will be like, they're never clean, but it's been cleaned at least. So it's kind of neat to see. I mean, in almost a bad way, I think that like they have this disparity, and that is something else I thought was really interesting about Manhattan and New York in general, and the boroughs as well. If you've never been here or lived here, like where I lived originally was in, actually I've lived now since I've gotten here in the past year, I've lived in New Jersey, and I've lived in Brooklyn, and now I've lived in Manhattan. So I've had 3 different places and 3 different levels of living conditions and style and costs. So I went from the bare bottom and up a little bit, and then up to where I am today in this apartment. And when I first arrived here, like it was very interesting to me, I guess like the deep-seated racism in the city. There's a very clear white and black divide. Obviously, a lot of people have crossed this divide. People are, generally pretty good. It's not like there's just blatant people yelling, racist things in the streets or anything. But there is a very clear like, this is a black neighborhood or this is a white neighborhood. Like if you ride the train again, certain stops, you'll see the average ethnicity of people getting off will be very heavily weighted towards one side or the other. Manhattan obviously is very, like I think more heavily white populated in the downtown and midtown areas, and then I think Harlem is kind of still a black area. And I've never really thought about these things too much. Coming from all the places that I've lived, it's never been an issue. I mean, I've often been the racial minority in areas, and everyone's obviously mostly friendly. Obviously, like you do get some racism, towards you, but most people are fairly great. And not that too many people are racist here, but there is this odd divide where like the cultures are so separated, and there is an actual giant cultural line. Whereas in London, for example, like I found that your race didn't really seem to have an impact on you culturally. Like everyone kind of acted like Londoners. Um, and then here it was like when I was in Brooklyn, it was very like you could like walk street by street and kind of like have an idea. So there's a ton of cultural things that are super fascinating here. Like I've been exposed to block parties. People have these big street parties and barbecues and things like that, which happened a lot in Brooklyn. There was also like at one point I went to go home and they'd gotten this giant speaker and it was just blasting music. My whole building was just vibrating like for about 12 hours. And they were out in the street and they had a, like, not even just a bouncy castle. They had this big air slide thing for the kids. And it was like this huge party event. They blocked off the whole street. And this isn't like some city event. This was literally just like the block deciding to throw a party. Which can be super annoying. I'll admit with the sound, I was not pleased having my walls vibrate all day long, but yeah, just a really interesting cultural event that I really haven't run into. People actually cracked open the fire hydrant and just sprayed water in the streets, and the kids played in that too. Like these are things I saw in like movies before that I always just thought were kind of fallacies, but they really do still happen here. So yeah, just kind of interesting stuff. I know me rambling on a camera forever probably isn't going to be too interesting, so I'll try to wrap this up here. But this, yeah, even just for me in the future, it's kind of cool to see all the different stages of life. So this is my New York stage. This is kind of what it's been like to live here and experience things here. I think New York is a city of extremes. So I think there's some extremely wonderful people and also some extremely shitty people here. And there's, you know, obviously some extremely rich and some extremely poor, and there's just this whole plethora of different ways to live and exist here. And I think it's really interesting, and also sometimes really a lot of terrible things come out of it, and that's also in itself kind of interesting. So yeah, I find New York a pretty fascinating area to live in. I think it's yeah, a pretty cool lifestyle for the most part, and you get to do some really cool stuff here. And yeah, it's very interesting, very different than anywhere else that I've ever lived, just based on the scale. Like nothing has ever gotten quite as big as the stuff gets in New York. So yeah, that's New York life. So now for anybody following along the trail, I've lived in Canada as a Canadian. I've lived on both sides, Ontario, Vancouver, or Toronto and Vancouver, I guess, for bigger cities. I've lived down in Florida. I've lived in Dublin, Ireland. I've lived in Tokyo and Nagoya in Japan, and then I've lived in Seoul in Korea. So I've gotten a lot of looks at different major cities in different areas in the world, and now I'm seeing Manhattan. So I hope this was entertaining. If anybody has any questions, as always, ask away. And sorry for the scratchy voice. I'm glad it's back enough I can talk now. I sounded very strange for the past few days. So see you guys around.